And it's time to get things started by introducing our moderator. He's a retired appeals court judge and a Ford Hall Forum board member, and he is the Honorable Rudolph Cass.
Thank you, Tom. It's my honor to introduce the speakers. Now, they're not going to be speakers in the usual sense of making set pieces, statements, but rather we're going to engage in a conversation this evening about civil liberties, and civil liberties as Professor Dershowitz has written, in a turbulent age. And I said to him, referring to his very recent book, Shouting Fire, available, I believe, in the corner, that Shouting Fire, of course, referring to Shouting Fire in a crowded theater, that probably in the next edition it will be referred to as Civil Liberties in an Age of Terrorism. Professor Dershowitz is a professor at Harvard Law School. He also he writes more books than I managed to read. Among them are Chutzpah, Reversal of Fortune, and the recently Shouting Fire, which I refer to here. He has acted time and again for clients, some very celebrated, among them Klaus von Bülow, O.J. Simpson, Anatoly Sharansky, Michael Milken, Mike Tyson. But half of the people for whom he appears pro bono, that is to say without charge, in the public interest. Time magazine has referred to him as the lawyer of last resort. Harvey Silverglate, it is important to note, was born on Mother's Day in 1942. He is the also relatively recent 1998 author of The Shadow University, which deals with the erosion of liberty as seen by him on American campuses, also available in the corner. He is a very able lawyer, a partner in the Boston law firm of Silverglate and Good, specializes in criminal defense, civil liberties, academic freedom, and criminal defense, both criminal and civil. Civil, as I guess, wasn't it Judge Fortescue once said, the perfect client is one who has a very deep pocket and has just a touch of danger. There's your favorite Silverglate client. He has had a career going back to representing the students who took over University Hall at Harvard in 1969, and I know that you'll enjoy him very much. If I go into all that he has done, I would be up here too long. We will begin the discussion with the source of civil liberties. Where do we get the notion that we have civil liberties in this country? Gentlemen?
Thank you very much, Judge Cass. First of all, you mentioned in the introduction that I'm sometimes called the lawyer of last resort. I never know whether that's intended as a compliment or an insult, but it's true. People call me when it's too late. I guess the most extreme case was one where a person wrote to me and asked me if I would defend him from the death penalty, and I got the letter on a Monday, and he had been executed the previous Thursday. And I took the case because he wanted his memory validated. When I was in Israel a couple of years ago and I spoke at Hebrew University, the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot got lawyer of last resort wrong in translation and described me as America's last resort lawyer. I agreed to do this debate tonight because I can't lose. I can't lose because Harvey was my student, and if he betters me, I get to take the credit. So
A student, as I understand it, always has to ask the teacher for forgiveness no matter how many times. By the way, Mr. Silverglate, are you the lawyer of first resort?
Well, actually, we do trials and appeals, so I guess we're first resort and last resort. We clean up our own messes.
But Harvey is the appellate lawyer's bane because they never lose, so they don't leave anything for us appellate lawyers. To the question at hand, where do rights come from? Oh, do I wish I could tell you that rights come from on high, that there are these 2 tablets which came down from Sinai, or there are these written documents, or nature provides for rights. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Rights don't come from God. They don't come from nature. They don't come clearly from the Constitution alone, because what if you then lived in a country in which the Constitution provided no rights? Rights grow out of experiences. They're human inventions. The essential place they come from is wrongs. That is, the experience of humankind with wrongs. We suffer wrongs. We go through things like the Inquisitions and the Star Chambers, and we learn from the mistakes of the past, and we create rights. We call them inalienable so that people won't take them away, but they're not inalienable because they don't come from an external source, from a lockbox in the sky. Our job is to advocate rights. Our job is to persuade the people that rights are important and that rights should trump even the majority. And so the struggle for liberties never stays won, and the struggle for rights never stays won. It would be so easy. It would be so easy if we could say, like some of my fundamentalist civil libertarians are able to say, rights are inherent. You can't be without them. They've always been here. End of argument. But inherency is an argument stopper, and as a teacher, I'm an argument starter. And so, reluctantly, I have to say rights are not inalienable. Rights have never been forever. I hope that rights consistently expand with experience. But, and here's where some of our disagreement will come tonight, the implications of expandable rights, non-Scalian expandable rights that change with experience, are that perhaps rights sometimes have to contract with experience, that sometimes we may learn from experience that a right that was important in the 19th century and tolerable in the 20th century may become intolerable in the 21st century. I'm going to talk about one such right, the right to anonymity. And we're going to have a real disagreement about that, but I wanted to first talk about the sources of rights before we got to the substance.
Well, and actually that's now, Alan, getting to where we disagree, because I'm not arguing that rights are absolute or rights are God-given. But I am going to argue, and this is really, I think, the core of our disagreement, that there are certain rights that really should not and cannot be touched. And the reason for that is that we have developed over many decades, in fact centuries, a certain what I call the look and feel of a free people. And there are you can tinker around the edges that we may, okay, well, wiretaps, maybe we can expand them a little and contract them a little. If the mafia happens to be very too powerful, you expand them a little, and when you get the mafia in prison, then you can contract them a little. You can play around at the edges, but there are certain things which account for the look and feel of a free people. And when I hear the phrase, 9/11 changed everything, I shudder, because it hasn't changed everything. There are certain things that still define the look and feel of a free people. And those are the areas I think we should not trench in. And that's where, surprisingly, you and I are. We have agreed many things over the years, and now suddenly I see my professor's wrong about something. It's a shattering experience, Alan.
Well, I hope to disabuse you of that perception. I don't think we disagree. I agree completely that there is the feel and the shape and the touch. I write in Shouting Fire that there are rights that are so important for me that I would die for them. I don't know whether I could kill for them, but I know I would die for certain rights, and I know that I would leave a country that didn't have those rights. I can't imagine myself compromising on the right of dissent, the right of free expression, the right of free thought, freedom of and from religion, ultimate and fundamental due process, and ultimate equal protection of the law. Now, we may therefore agree on the conception, but disagree on what are the rights that define a free society. I believe that we can have a free society. Indeed, every one of the so-called compromises that we're going to talk about tonight are compromises. I don't see them as compromises. For example, my case for a national ID card is going to be a case based on civil liberties. That is, I believe, and it's an empirical claim, and if you can disprove me empirically, I will change my view. My empirical claim is that the national ID card that I propose will actually promote, not retard, civil liberties, that it will end any excuse we have for racial profiling. It will not focus all of our attention on a small number of minorities. It will make us each have a little bit of inconvenience in order to make sure that all of us, most of us, are free of any inconvenience, and harassment and hasslement is imposed on a small number of people. Let me just lay out
what is your proposal for a national
My
ID
proposal
card?
is very simple. It would be a telemetric card that would have no private or personal data on it whatsoever. It would simply have name, photograph, and a telemetric chip, which is matchable either to your fingerprint or to your retinal print. It would only be designed to make sure that when you have to show your ID, as we have to today when we go to an airport or a government building, or unfortunately all too often to large private buildings, when the government or the private sector has the right to ask you for an ID, that we have 100% certainty that you are not engaged in identity theft. It would contain no privacy information. That's why I think we must distinguish between the right of privacy, which I feel very, very strongly about, and the right of anonymity, which I feel equally strongly about. I don't believe it. I don't believe in it. I do believe in the right of anonymity, for example, in handing out a leaflet or sending nasty notes about me on the Internet, which is very commonly done. But I don't believe that any American in the year 2002 has the right to walk around with a bag over his head, has the right to give a false name, has the right to refuse to pay his or her income taxes because the income taxes require you to give your correct name, your correct Social Security number, and an enormous amount of private information about your income, about your charitable deductions if you choose to take charitable deductions. And I believe, and I'll give you some experience from this, and then I'll end.
This question, it seems to me just about 50 years ago, after college, I was traveling in Europe, and I remember being struck that in Germany, in Austria, and I was based primarily in Berlin, I kept being asked for identification, Ausweis. People would ask for identification. Well, you'd present your passport, and thinking at the time, well, I'm glad I'm from a country where that doesn't happen. The police aren't forever asking people in uniform to produce identification. And what is it about 50 years later that you think has changed that value?
Well, actually, this is the one area, the only area that I've actually changed my mind about since September 11th. On September 10th, if you had asked me about national ID cards, I think I would have given you a thoughtless, knee-jerk, automatic answer. The Nazis used it, Stalin used it, I'm against it. Apartheid used it, I'm against it. Of course, now the English use it, the French use it, the Italians use it, it's used all over. I am not in favor of the European system where the police can come over and ask you to identify yourself. I think we have to distinguish three things very importantly. One, when the police can ask you for your ID card, and I would never increase the amount of time that the police can ask you. It's just that when they can now ask you, you should have an obligation to produce a correct one. Second, what private information would be on any database linked to your ID? And that's a debate we should be having today. Whenever you show your passport at an airport today, they link into a database, and none of you in this room has any idea what's on that database. We should know what's on that database. We should be debating that issue. In fact, the telemetric ID card is a great heuristic for getting us to debate the two things we're not debating today, namely, when should the police be allowed to ask you to identify yourself, and what kind of data should the government have in any database about you. And so what's changed is the experience of September 11th, which was primarily a failure of personnel, not a failure of law, a failure of intelligence. But it did make it clear to me that I think that if you go to an airport, if you choose to do certain things, by the way, my national ID card, you would not be required to carry it. There would be no criminal penalty for not having it. But if you go to an airport and you don't have it, then you can either be turned away or you can be required to go into a slow line where the government can then make all kinds of more probing checks about you. The same thing would be true of a governmental building. That's true today. If you don't have an ID card, you can't get into Congress. The only difference is my ID card would not be from Virginia. It wouldn't be a driver's license obtained the way Virginia licenses are obtained. There's an Al-Qaeda manual telling terrorists how to get Virginia driver's licenses and how to go to various states where it's easy to get driver's licenses and fake them. I don't think anybody has the right to identity theft.
Okay, now, you said that you don't think that we have a right to anonymity. I disagree with you. I think the right to anonymity goes back to the pre-Revolutionary War times when circulars and treatises and tracts were produced with phony names in order that the king not know whom to pick up. And in fact, the Supreme Court has held that anonymity still attaches to the right to circulate political leaflets. You don't have to sign your name. So there is a right to anonymity. The only question is how far does it extend? And let me tell you what I think the problem is with your ID card proposal, which I do believe is a fundamental invasion of the liberties of a free people. It's not a peripheral issue to me. And it's a look and feel issue, if I may again steal the language of the software engineers. Actually, it's the software copyright lawyers, I suppose. The whole notion, and I think Judge Cass actually touched upon this. I know the French do it and the Germans do it, and I'm sure that that's the model that we're supposed to. Well, they're a free people, so if they do it, we can do it. I disagree. I think that the whole notion that a person walking the street completely innocently, or even thinking bad thoughts, it can be stopped and asked to identify himself or herself, and it essentially can be asked to account for why they're there, what they're doing, is fundamentally antithetical to being a free person. Now, you're going to say to me, I know so far you agree with me, but now comes the trap. You said that the whole the problem really is what's in the database, what circumstances, under what circumstances can you be forced to produce this card, what's in the database that tells whoever reads the card or puts it into a scanner everything or nothing about you. That's where you say we should be having the argument. I disagree because, you see, the nature of these kinds of incursions in rights is that once the government gets its foot in the door, that door gets smashed wide open, and it doesn't take too long for that to happen. Once we accept the initial threshold proposition that every citizen has to have, and you say, well, you don't have to carry it all the time, you just have to have it. If in 2010 you have to have it, in 2012 you'll have to carry it. In 2014 you'll have to show it to any police officer who stops you on the street, and by 2020 you have to show it to your mailman. And that's my problem. I think that you change the look and feel of a free country, and then the incursions, every 2 years there's a new Congress, and every 2 years there's a new law.
Can you imagine this debate 100 years ago in this church, which is older than that, and this brilliant civil libertarian talking about, my God, think of what they're proposing as an amendment to the Constitution, something that requires every single American citizen to give us his correct name, his source of income, his employer's name, if he chooses charities, if he wants to make a contribution. The government database for the Internal Revenue System will be incredible, unbelievable. It's the beginning of the slippery slope. Don't give the government the power to tax. If you give the government the power to tax, my God, the next thing they're going to want to do is register your guns. And when they register your guns, you never know. The next thing they're going to want to do is register your cars. And after that, I mean, the slippery slope is an argument I live by, obviously. We're all concerned about the slippery slope and the camel's nose in the tent, and the civil libertarian concern is that. But we have proved in this country that we do have the ability, and this, some of you will laugh at me, the Internal Revenue Service has been a 99.9% success. We had the Nixon a situation where he misused the Internal Revenue Service that became a national scandal. A couple of years ago, my wife and I got a call from the Justice Department saying we had been the victim of an Internal Revenue agent that had improperly looked into our return and the return of 18 other people, the president of Harvard, I think Bobby Orr, and I was great company. I was flattered. But this man, who was an IRS agent, was actually prosecuted. And the reason I got the call was to do a victim impact statement, whether he should go to jail or not. He was being represented by one of my friends, so I couldn't bring myself to have him ask him to go to jail. But the Internal Revenue Service has been a model, in many ways, disproving the slippery slope. Now, if it turns, you may be right. You may be right. And the real point is the risk that you may be right enough to prevent us from doing what other countries have done who have maintained a very, very high level of freedom? And I don't believe that the feel and touch of France is today dramatically different than the feel of touch of freedom in America.
Well,
although, explain it to me one more time. What actually is the utility of the national ID card?
The utility is that it prevents identity theft and makes it much, much harder for somebody. Let me go once
they steal your identity, they get everything, is what it is.
I have one more proposal which I wasn't clear about. I was talking about for American citizens. For people visiting the United States, I would go much further, and I would have a mandatory ID card which you must have on you as a guest and visitor of this country. And I'd be much, much tougher on the way in which we control our borders against visitors. I don't think I would necessarily apply it to long-term residents. I don't make the sharp distinction between citizenship and residency that the Bush administration does. But visitors who are here on 30, 60, 90-day visiting, I would permit much greater control and much greater intrusion, essentially, on any anonymity claims that they have. But for American citizens, all it would mean is when you go to the airport and you say your name is Harvey Silverglate, you're Harvey Silverglate, and you're not somebody else. And today we're looking for named people, according to the newest FBI alert. I doubt any of them are in this country. But remember, of the people who were involved in September 11th, several of them were people whose names, if they had given correct names, would have clicked into IDs and may very well have thwarted that attempt. Do I think this will stop terrorism? No. Do I think it achieves an appropriate balance between improving our chances of stopping terrorism at very, very low cost? Yes. Do I think there are some risks? Yeah. And if Harvey is proved right, I will help lead the campaign to undo the harm we've done. Harvey's response is you can't undo those harms. And you may be right.
This
is a hard question.
harder to undo.
I agree with that.
I mean, we add laws. We generally don't subtract them, and that's the problem. And we get used to it. That's really the problem. We get used to it.
Well, we got used to the IRS. And
some of us more than others, I suspect. And in any event...
I'm used to it. I now think the IRS is a good thing.
Were we not told that Social Security numbers would only be used to identify a Social Security account? Now they are everywhere. They are essentially a form of identification. They're on your driver's license. So I've heard this before. Been there, done that.
No, but it's interesting. I agree with you on the Social Security card. Everything the Social Security card is being used for today is essentially illegal, and the reason none of us objects is we couldn't care less. In fact, not only have we gotten used to the Social Security card being a national ID number, it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't harm us. It doesn't deny us our rights of privacy. I would throw the question back both of you and Judge Cass. What's the downside? What part of your freedom is taken away by requiring you to correctly identify yourself, telemetrically checked, when the government has the proper authority to ask you to identify yourself? What do we lose? What part of freedom have we surrendered by that?
We have given up our right to anonymity under circumstances where we have a right to be anonymous. And that's what we've given up. And if that sounds too kind of squishy to you, what I tell you is that is what we have come to understand as the look and feel of a free people. And it is, of course, because these are not God-given, at least I don't believe they're God-given rights. I have to say that I can't say that, there's some absolute authority that says this is a right. But what I can tell you is that from before the Revolutionary War, we had this right, and there was a reason for it. We continue to fight for it under many circumstances where there's tremendous pressure for incursions of these rights, and I think that it survived for hundreds of years. There's a reason that it survived hundreds of years.
The reference to the revolutionary period and the antecedents of a country, of course, are interesting. In a way, there was less anonymity because the communities were small. We knew who people were. We knew who we were. I suppose an argument could be made that in a highly complex society where it is often necessary to identify yourself because people don't know who you are, that a standard of identification might be useful. Not everybody drives a car. I have a friend who doesn't drive a car, although he says he understands the theory of the thing.
Well, I think we have to distinguish also. Harvey says, I'm willing to accept anonymity, but I don't go as far as he does. I think I'm talking about differences not of degree, but differences of kind. I think the right to send an anonymous internet message, the right to send an anonymous leaflet is a different right from the right not to have to identify yourself when you go into an airport or another building. I favor the right of anonymity. For example, Harvey and I think will agree, I think there's been a terrible compromise on rights involving juries. I think we would both agree the right to an anonymous jury is a very bad thing in our society. It used to be that we knew the names of jurors. Now, you don't get to know the names of jurors in cases involving very bad defendants. And it sends a terrible message to the jury. If you get to be part of an anonymous jury, you got something to worry about, and you better darn well convict this defendant. Harvey, don't you agree with me that it's wrong to have anonymous juries?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You're doing a certain public service. That's a very different situation.
I know, so is mine.
Walking down the street and being stopped by a police officer. And my point still is, if you think that won't come within 6 or 7 years of forcing everybody to carry an ID card, I think that's very naive.
Okay, I think that's
and
the debate. I think the issues are very clear between us.
Let's take the airport example, by the way.
Yep.
It's okay that you force a person to identify himself before he gets on a plane. If you don't like it, I suppose you don't have to fly. But let's face it.
Well, what are you going to do? You have to do it to get on a train?
Whoa. That's not really what protects us. What protects us is the search. Because you can have a person who identifies himself who gets on a plane with a bomb in his shoe. And the whole notion that as long as you know who the person is, it's maybe 250 years ago, you point out, we all knew each other. We don't all know each other. The fact that I produce a driver's license, a picture ID says Harvey Silverglate, of what assurance is that I'm not going to try to blow up a plane, other than I'm afraid of falling.
But Harvey, if we had this debate 40 years ago, I would bet you would have been sitting there saying, no metal detectors at airports. The next step will be metal detectors in schools. The step after that will be metal detectors when the president is speaking somewhere and you have to go through buildings, and you would have been absolutely right. We've gotten used to metal detectors.
Not all of us have.
I have, and I like metal detectors.
Absolutely not.
I like metal detectors. I don't want to need metal detectors in schools, but if we need metal detectors in schools, I want the schools to have metal detectors. I think people have a right to a knife and gun-free educational environment, and I do think that, nobody would have, the framers of the Constitution wouldn't have thought of metal detectors, but times change and things change, and I do think that metal detectors are good. I just wanted to give you one historical experience, and that is this. When I came to Harvard, when we both came to Harvard in the early 60s, there were very few African Americans among the student body and the faculty. Late 60s, more African American students began to appear, and many of them came to my office, and I'm sure Harvey's office, to complain about the fact that they were being hassled at Harvard and around Harvard Square. They didn't look like they belonged. And when Harvard finally issued ID cards, and they weren't mandatory, but they were mandatory, you had to show your ID card to get into the dormitory, what happened was two things. One, the amount of hassling of African American students went down considerably, because as soon as they showed the card, they were treated as the ladies and gentlemen that they should have been treated like all the time. But they got asked to show their cards more often. There's no question about that. But on balance, the total amount of hassling that they experienced was far less great. What happened is that the hassling got spread out more widely among the entire population of students. And that's what I see as a big benefit. Today,
we only hassle the townies. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, that's right. And that's a legitimate distinction when you're talking about coming onto the Harvard campus. But when today, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, people who look Mideastern, are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the hassling and the ethnic and profiling and identification. And I think if everybody had to show that perfect card, if you were coming on the plane with a Quran and you were wearing clothing that identified you as Muslim or Arabic, and you had that perfect telemetric card, it would give a higher sense of security and a lower level of excuse to do the hassling that exists today.
If a student really got hassled a lot on the Harvard campus, the student could always then request the card, or even a letter from the dean, saying, this student has been hassled too much, leave him alone upon presentation of this letter.
Yeah, but I've done that. I did that with a kid who lived in my house. Rory Morton lived in my house. It was an African-American student who's now the dean at Shady, at Buckingham, Brown, and Nichols schools, and we finally brought him down to the police station and showed him around and gave him a letter. I don't think an African-American or an Arabic student should be required to have a special card or a special letter. I would much prefer to take the position that the king of Denmark took when they required the Jews to wear the Stars of David. He wore a Star of David, and he told everybody in his nation to wear a Star of David, and that made everybody seem a little bit more equal. So I'd prefer to carry that ID card as my Star of David for my Arab American and Muslim American
compatriots. You're welcome to do it. I have no problem with voluntary servitude. It's involuntary servitude.
Well, the question is it servitude? And you say you can choose not to fly. What are you going to do? Take a train? They require it today.
I have no problem
drive, sit home.
I have no problem presenting a picture ID when I get on a plane. I don't think, by the way, it provides 1 ounce of real protection for anybody.
Not today.
I'm happy to do it if it makes Delta Airlines feel good.
No, it makes me feel good when my fellow flyer has to show a genuine card. It's not Delta that feels good. I want to feel good when I'm flying. I want to feel comfortable. And it gives me a certain level of security to know that there is a national card that can't be faked. So easy to fake today's. Check how many kids today have fake IDs. There'll be time for questions.
We'll have the question period later.
I'm delighted to have the machines tested. I love technology. I'm not a civil libertarian Luddite. I'm not afraid of machines. Machines that can test the accuracy of a card are good things, not bad things. Yes?
Can you type?
I'm a Luddite in practice, not in theory.
That was a dirty trick.
It was perfectly fair.
Shall we get on to the torture
Why don't we
area?
discuss
Because
torture?
I think now that we're talking about look and feel, I think that really will exemplify the problem that Alan and I face when we discuss these things.
Sure.
You wrote an article, an op-ed in the L.A. Times, and actually you've written about this for years.
Yeah,
it's just that
chapter of my book.
Right, and the essay in your book is from at least, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So you've been on this kick for a while, but nobody noticed it because I don't think anyone took you seriously until 9/11. And all of a sudden now, the country is talking about torture. And I think one of the reasons we're talking about it is because there's a suspicion it's being done in Guantanamo, and there's a suspicion, now maybe it is, maybe it isn't, being done in Afghanistan and for information. And so now we're talking about whether it should be institutionalized so that we can do it lawfully rather than always be against the law. And we've talked about this a lot lately, and I thought maybe you should explain what your proposal is, and then I can explain what I think
But
is
I'd just like to ask you one question first to see whether there's any real disagreement. If we had the actual ticking bomb case, that is, if in Guantanamo or in Afghanistan or in Pakistan we came upon the terrorist who was picked up on a tape recording bragging to his friends credibly about an attack on a major commercial center in the United States, which he claimed would have thousands of casualties and would occur in 2 days or a day. And it was not enough information to get to take specific proactive steps, but we believed it was true. It would satisfy not only probable cause, but say the high level of probable cause that we need to use lethal force, say, to shoot a fleeing felon. If we had that case, and if we knew the only way to save thousands of innocent anonymous civilians was to take this one terrorist who's an admitted terrorist on the tape and get a sterilized needle, and you'll have to bear with me on this, and put it under his nail until it produced such excruciating pain.
But non-lethal, right?
Non-lethal.
We're nice
guys. Non-lethal. Very important to distinguish non-lethal from lethal. And provided us with information that had to be self-proving. I would never believe anything told to me under this kind of pain-producing procedure, but it then proved to be true, and we saved the 2,000 lives. Before we get into our discussion, would you agree that would be, quote, the right thing to do?
I'd want to know, can we try something less?
No. I want to be very, very...
How about...
Start out with threatening to tell us
how about sodium pentothal?
Well, you can start out with that. Sodium pentothal is not particularly effective on people who want to withhold the information.
Is torture effective in people who might want to then to relieve the pain and tell you a false story?
It is, and that's why you have to test the validity of the story. There's actually a case. Let me just describe a case. Case in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. People don't realize that we have precedents on this. Here's the facts. Only involved one person. Somebody got off the airplane at Florida Miami Airport, got into a cab. The whole thing was planned. The man in the cab had a compatriot in the cab. They kidnapped this wealthy person from Miami. They knew he was coming in. They took him to a faraway place, and they called the family, and they asked for ransom. The family agreed to pay ransom, unbeknownst to the kidnappers. The family also called the police. The one kidnapper stayed behind with the victim, who was tied up. The other kidnapper went to pay the ransom. The police immediately arrested the kidnapper. It was as clear a case of guilt as could possibly be, and they asked the kidnapper where the hostage was. The kidnapper said, "I'm not going to tell you." They then tortured him, the Miami police. Without any doubt, they tortured him. The dissenting judge called it the rack and the screw. The majority judges described it as strangling him until he produced the information and threatening to continue to strangle him and come back and strangle him if the information proved to be false. The information proved to be true. The person's life was saved. And then the case became interesting. 3 hours later, they gave him his Miranda warnings, gave him a lawyer, and he confessed because the cat was out of the bag. And not surprisingly, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that the second confession was completely voluntary and not in any way a product of the first confession, but went out of their way in dictum to say that we can't really even criticize what the police did. After all, they did not act in this manner in order to induce a confession. They acted in this manner in order to save a life, and they are essentially to be commended for it. Is there anybody in this room who has any doubt? Let's talk empirically first. If we had a ticking bomb case, an actual ticking bomb case, is there anybody in this room who would have any doubt that the CIA, the FBI, local police would engage in torture? It might not be sophisticated torture under the nails, but beating up, threatening, etc., in order to get that information to save lives? Just show of hands.
No.
Who thinks there would be doubt that they would actually do it?
I'm just going to interfere with this for one moment, the game show. And here's the problem. You're asking the wrong question, Alan.
Well, but let me get an answer first, and then you can object.
Hold on. Before we have a vote on here, because of course the vote's going to be unanimous, I would raise my hand.
Okay,
you're asking the wrong question.
Well, I'm asking my question. You can ask your question, okay?
The clever professor knows how to ask the question to get the answer he wants, but that's not the problem. The problem is whether or not we should institutionalize.
That's the second question.
No.
You can't get to the second question until you get to the first question.
I'll concede then the answer to the first question.
I know you concede.
I'll postpone the vote for a moment because before people vote, they should know what they're voting on and where the vote's going to end up. And here's the problem.
But you can have them vote anything you want them to vote. Second. Okay, go ahead.
My goal is to have you agree, not them agree. Here's the problem. We already have a substantial amount of torture in our society. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I have many a client come in beaten to a pulp from a local police station where, of course, the police officer says he fell down a flight of steps. Too bad he was drunk, of course. There's no blood alcohol. And we know that there's torture. We know the Louima case, that once in a while we even find out about it. And we have too much torture, actually.
Right.
And for no reason or insufficient reason.
Right.
And the problem, we have fought for hundreds of years to develop a society that's decent enough that it disapproves of torture and disapproves of it in the strongest, most absolute terms. And I have a problem with letting this particular genie out of this particular bottle merely as a result of a hypothetical, the rare hypothetical where all of us would agree if it was my kid buried in a box with 2 hours of oxygen, of course I would torture the person to tell me where the box is. And that, however, doesn't justify, as a society, our developing a systematic torture, because then every police officer in every station, every military person, in fact, every citizen would think, well, it's really okay. It doesn't have to be 2 hours of oxygen. It could be 2 weeks of oxygen. It doesn't even have to be such an awful hypothetical. If somebody has stolen a box of Wheaties, I can torture them. There is this creep. You see, that's
same slippery slope, right?
There's a slippery slope here, and it is a slippery slope.
Again.
There really is a slippery slope. It's a reality. Okay. And let me finish. And the idea that we should apply to a judge for a warrant to torture somebody strikes me as being the ultimate institutionalizing of a very bad idea. Now, what would I do? So let's take the hypothetical, not hypothetical, the actual case you just cited.
Right.
I think those officers should have been indicted. After all, it was a crime. And I think that it should have been up to a jury to decide whether or not to convict. I think it is likely that you would have a jury either hang or acquit. I don't think you would have gotten 12 out of 12 people to convict. And I think that's a case in which the conscience of the community would decide in this particular case, since honestly, I would have done the same thing, I can't really convict this person. I think that's what would have happened, unless they had a terrible defense lawyer, the police officer. And I think that's how these cases should be handled, as each case should be handled on its own facts as an exception, not as an institutionalized, it's okay to torture. And that's the real disagreement.
That's the real disagreement.
And you think I'm being dishonest about it.
Well, let me make my argument. First, I think I think there are three positions you can take to start. And I really want to have a minute to get the three positions laid out. The three positions on the hypothetical, and by the way, it isn't a hypothetical. That case actually occurred in Israel. The Israeli security services had somebody, and they didn't torture him, and the bus blew up, and 14 people were killed, and the security services then went to the press with the story, and it became a major issue because it wasn't a hypothetical. So there are three positions you can take. You can take the purest position. You can take the position that it is not better that one person be non-lethally tortured than that 1,000 innocent people be saved. You can take that purest position. You can take the second position. It is better that one person be non-lethally tortured and 1,000 lives be saved. By the way, that's not only a conservative position. Jeremy Bentham took that position, and he wrote 2 long articles about it. In fact, what he said was he doesn't believe in punishment, which is retroactive, but he does believe in torture, which is prospective if it can save multiple lives. Not surprising for a utilitarian. Then there's the third, and that position, if we're going to do it, we ought to do it openly. Then there's the third position, the position that I think Harvey takes, and that is we should do it in extreme cases, but we shouldn't institutionalize it. But of course we should institutionalize it by having it part of our system of the necessity defense. The defendant can raise the necessity defense and let a jury decide whether or not in this particular case there was justification. I think this sort of
one thing. I don't say we should do it. I say we will do it.
No.
It's human nature to do it. And then the issue is how do we deal with it?
In the TV debate with me, you said you would do it.
Yes, but that doesn't mean we should do it. That doesn't mean it's right.
No. Let's be clear about that. Let me be clear about that. Are you telling me here today that you think it would be wrong for a president or the head of the FBI or the head of the CIA to permit non-lethal torture, that is 2 hours of extraordinary pain, on a guilty terrorist, let me finish my question, in order to save 1,000 lives? Do you think that would be wrong?
I believe it would be wrong but necessary, and I think you
what does
can
that mean?
Entertain those two notions at the same time.
Explain how it could be wrong but necessary.
I think we cannot, as a society, approve the use of torture.
I didn't ask you whether you approve it. Is it right? Is it wrong?
When a society approves of something, it becomes right. I don't think we can approve of it. I think we can say that there are certain extreme circumstances where we're forced to do things that we all deem wrong. And then it's up to the society.
You're not forced to do it. You're making a choice.
There is then a jury that decides whether or not we should be convicted for doing something that we as a society agree is wrong and illegal. What I'm telling you is most juries would acquit under the circumstances
and you would
of
be
these
happy
hypotheticals.
with that.
I would vote to acquit if I was on the jury. I would do the torture if I was in that position. That doesn't make it right. And I know
you're misusing the word right. You're misusing the word right. You're saying a jury should acquit and you would do it.
Once you say it's right, once you say torture is okay under XYZ server and you spell them out, you have let the genie out of the bottle, and we're going to have far more torture.
I understand that argument.
In the shadows and out of the shadows than we have.
What you're saying, let me try to paraphrase. What I think you're saying is it is right to torture under that circumstance. You would do it. You're a good person. You would only do something that is right. But you don't want to declare it to be, but you don't, let me finish, but you don't want to declare it to be right. Instead, you want to set up a black box process called the jury. Somebody that never has to explain what they do, and leave it to the discretion of these 12 people in the hope and expectation that they will do your dirty work and the judge's dirty work that they're unwilling and unable to do. I believe that that's exactly the wrong way to go in a democracy. I think there are only two choices in a democracy. That is, either you have to bite the bullet and take the purest position. It is not only wrong to torture to save 1,000 lives, but whoever does it should be prosecuted and convicted, or if a president does it, impeached and removed. It is wrong. There's no right about it. It does not come under the necessity defense. Either that, or to say it is always wrong except in this case. And the reason it's right in this case is for these reasons, and we should institutionalize that.
You know what's so interesting? Both of us are accusing the other of using Orwellian language.
Right.
Because what you're saying is democracy requires a single judge approve of the torture rather than 12 jurors in the community.
I don't care about whether it's a judge.
I deem that my proposal to be more democratic, actually. And I would much rather leave this decision.
You're misusing the word democracy now. It is not democratic to have standardlessness decisions. What I'm talking about is accountability. Phil Hyman has a wonderful episode that he describes in his book. He describes an episode where the Israelis used what they call extreme physical pressure on a terrorist, and he confessed and this time prevented a terrorist act. And the head of the Shin Bet, the Israeli Security Services, told the Prime Minister what had happened. The Prime Minister got furious at him and said, "Never, ever tell me about things like that. If you have to do it, but I don't want to know about it." And that's the worst aspect of democratic unaccountability. That's Nixon's off-the-shelf use of the plumbers. That's Reagan's off-the-shelf foreign policy. If we're gonna do it and we're gonna tolerate it, we darn well better be explicit about it. You know, you miss
the contrary.
Let me explain my view.
Accountability. I think these people.
Whoa.
I think that people who torture should be indicted.
That's not accountability, because they won't be, because that's prosecutorial discretion. Now let me all surprise you, and let me tell you what my actual view is. My actual view is the purist view. I am actually now against the use of all torture and would take the position that it would be wrong to do under all circumstances. And if I had any confidence that we could abolish torture by taking a vote here tonight, I would say, even though it would be very selfish of me in some respects, because I'm not likely to be one of the people killed by the terrorists, that's probably something we ought to do. But I'm not prepared to take, under any circumstances, the Silverglate approach, which is, I hope it's done, I wish it's done, somebody else will do it, but I'm not going to dirty my hands in it. Let me just give you one vignette.
May I ask a pragmatic question?
Yeah.
Do we know anything about the effectiveness of torture in
Yes.
extracting information?
We do. Unfortunately, it's the most effective way of getting information. And you know, how do we know it? Because it was used effectively by some terrible, terrible regimes over time, and by not so terrible regimes. The French used it, of course. Let me tell you how I came to this view. I came to this view in 1988 as the result of my wife and I being in Israel.
The French, you just held them up as a wonderful look and feel free society.
I'm saying, well, not in Algeria they weren't. When they were running a colonialist regime, I'm talking about when Sartre and Camus were writing about it. But let me tell you how I came to this, because I think it's an interesting biographical statement. Be very brief. Carolyn and I were in Israel in 1988 lecturing at Hebrew University on civil liberties during times of crisis. And I made a speech coming out unequivocally against what Israel was doing. What Israel was doing in those days, by the way, was not nearly close to what the French were doing. It was closer to what the English were doing. What they were doing is they were taking people who they believed had information that could prevent terrorist attacks. They were putting them in a dark room with blaring loud music, putting a smelly sack over their head and shaking them vigorously and having enormous success in getting the information. No lethal force was applied. Even B'Tselem, which is a very radical organization, found no cases of permanent physical harm, but it was horrible what they were doing. And I came out against it. And at dinner party after dinner party and lecture after lecture, all of my good civil libertarian friends said to me, aha, but what about the ticking bomb case? What about the ticking bomb case? Not a hypothetical in Israel. And finally, I wrote an article in response to that saying, look, if your point is that you think you need torture in the ticking bomb case, and I refuse to call it just extreme physical pressure, it was a form of torture. Torture is a matter of degree. If you think you need to use that, then darn it, get your judge's hands filthy and require a torture warrant. It was a heuristic to force the hands of those Israelis who were saying the ticking bomb case justified us allowing the Shin Bet to do what they're doing, which was a pervasive system of using this without any accountability and lying about it. And in my book, I have an article, Is It Necessary to Torture? And lie about it, because they were being permitted to lie about it. What I wanted to do was surface it, bring it out of the fog of war into the public sphere of public accountability. And it started a great debate in Israel. You know what the result was? 2 years ago, the Israeli Supreme Court totally and unequivocally abolished torture and said even if it's necessary, it can no longer be used. Now, of course, they had a little footnote, which I call the Silverglate footnote. It had a footnote written by my dear friend Aaron Barak, who's the president of the Supreme Court, and a great civil libertarian, as great a civil libertarian as Harvey Silverglate. And it said, there's no jury system in Israel, if a Shin Bet officer actually feels that there is a ticking bomb case and it's absolutely necessary to use this kind of physical pressure to save thousands of lives, he may choose to do it. And if he does, he may try to defend himself in front of a judge on grounds of necessity. And if he persuades the judge on grounds of necessity he should be acquitted, then so be it. And my point, I was very critical of that decision, is, Barack, if you think a judge should acquit after the fact, you have the obligation to say that before the fact. You have the obligation to dirty your hands and give this man permission to do it so that he doesn't have to guess, so that he, the low-ranking official, doesn't get screwed by the system after he saved all these lives, and you from your highfalutin bench can say, well, on balance, we think maybe it wasn't
that is not the Silverglate
You
footnote,
take
Alan.
Responsibility.
Alan, I don't think the decision should be made by a judge. And that's where we disagree. I think it is a profound decision that should not be made by the lawmakers, the lawgivers, or the law interpreters.
Before you say another word, I think we have reached the magic time when we ought to invite the participation of the wider audience. Do feel free to ask questions. This is the glory of the Ford Hall Forum over the decades. Let me see if I can raise this. But they should be questions. That is to say, we do not want you to engage in speeches. Yes, sir.
My favorite T-shirt is one that says, God says, don't trust the government. I never wear it because of the myth of the God theory, but notwithstanding, it's not a slippery slope, Alan. It's a luge tract. You give this all-powerful government the right to make these kinds of decisions about when they have a right to violate your anonymity, to violate your person with torture. It's the all-powerful government that it was only a miracle that they caught Nixon before Mitchell had all those people in the Huskell. And Harvey, what are you saying? At least Alan is saying he's willing to take what Jesus and Gandhi and Martin Luther King said, I will stand on principle, I will not cause any harm to people. And you're saying wink. At least how...
No, I'm not... Is that a question or...
I can't understand how either of you are taking these positions. Defend yourselves!
So your question is, how can you take those positions?
Okay. And I want to be clear that I do not think that torture is right. I therefore disagree that we should have an institutionalized system for approving of it and allowing it. I think it's wrong. I happen to think that you or I, in the right circumstances, Woody, would torture somebody. You may not think you're capable of it, but trust me, you are, in the right circumstances. And that's the problem. We're all human beings. We all have our limits. I don't think, however, that those limits should be given the approval of law, that we should be charged for violating the norms of civilization. And if 12 out of 12 people think they would have done the same thing under those circumstances, life is complex. They'll acquit. I don't, however, and this is what you've been trying to get me to say, that torture can be right in certain circumstances. I won't say that because I don't believe it. I think it's wrong in all circumstances, but I think as human beings we would do it. We have to figure out as a society how to deal with it after the fact, but not before the fact.
Let me make a somewhat more radical statement. I think torture, because it has the historical roots that it has and grows out of the Inquisition.
And it sounds awful.
I was just about to make that point. There's a large aesthetic about this argument. We all in this room tolerate, we don't approve of, most of us, the death penalty. We tolerate a society which can shoot a fleeing felon. This is going to sound strange, but pain is way, way overrated. If you gave the choice today to every inmate of Rikers Island whether or not they would be willing to trade 1 hour of excruciating pain or 10 lashes from a whip for 1 day in Rikers Island, any rational inmate would choose the pain. You don't get AIDS, you don't get raped, and you don't get a shiv in the stomach from pain. When the United States government hypocritically protested the whipping of that young man, the American in Singapore, I almost threw up. And I wrote a letter to President Clinton saying, how dare you protest? You're the man who, first of all, signed the statute in Arkansas permitting corporal punishment of school children. Second of all, if my son, who was then in his 20s, did something wrong and had a choice between 15 medically administered lashes and 15 days in Rikers Island, I'd make the decision in a snap, and he would agree with me.
But Alan,
what's
what you're saying is that Rikers Island
about pain?
No. Rikers Island is torture. Anybody who knows anyone who spent time there, it's torture.
But we do it, and we do it.
We ought to allow time for some further questions, sir.
Currently, the Department of Transportation under Secretary Mineta has said that all airline passengers are to be, if they're to be interrogated or to be thoroughly searched, are to be done so only on a random basis. Mm-hmm. Given the fact that 100% of the people who committed the acts of terrorism on September 11 were Muslims of Middle Eastern extraction, do you think that Secretary Mineta and the Department of Transportation's current edict makes sense?
I think it does make sense, and I'll tell you why. I know all the arguments for racial and ethnic profiling, that since it was only people of men of Middle Eastern extraction who crashed the planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, we waste our time, we waste our resources searching an 83-year-old woman from Dubuque. And that argument would make sense except for one thing. We do not want to treat certain citizens as a fifth column. We certainly don't want to treat them that way. We don't want people to be tempted to think of themselves as a fifth column. We want everybody to feel that they're part of our community. It is very important for our own safety and security, if not our pride, that we treat all citizens alike. I'd be perfectly willing to have more people searched so that we don't search people just on the basis of ethnicity. And incidentally, you think the terrorists are dumb? If you start searching everyone who looks like A, they'll recruit people who look like B. We just saw the other day the first female suicide bomber. Oh, they didn't think women did it before. Now we're going to have to add them to the profile. So, in fact, it is a losing game to think that you're going to get much security through profiling. So I think that for practical as well as moral reasons, we shouldn't be doing it.
I strongly favor profiling. I just don't favor racial profiling. Profiling is a very useful way of identifying people. I want to know where they've traveled. I want to know if they have a criminal record. I want to know a range of things, if we can, without invading privacy, about them. Profiling is wonderful. What's wrong is stupid and racist profiling. I think there's a big difference, by the way, between searching only Muslim Arabs and searching all Muslim Arabs. It would be dead wrong to search everybody who looked Muslim or looked Arabic. That would clearly be wrong. There's a case in the Second Circuit which is very interesting on this. There's a case in which a person was beaten, and the ID, which looked like a pretty good one, was unfortunately an all too typical ID, African-American male between the ages of so-and-so with in this case, with a cut on the finger. And the people in, I forget the name of the town, upstate New York, searched and only went after young African-American men, and then looked to see if they had a cut on the finger and immediately released them. If they didn't, they found 7 or 8 who had cuts on the finger, and they went further. And the Second Circuit upheld that, saying that was very different because the identification was race-specific. Here, it's not. Here, anybody could become a terrorist. We've had probably more terrorism in this country committed by white Protestants and Catholics and Jews. The JDL and others, we represented some of them. So it clearly would be foolish to...
he was a nice boy, though.
Either limit ourselves to that. So I think we agree that in our opposition to racial or ethnic profiling, but I think profiling is a good thing if it's done on the basis of relevant characteristics.
I'm going to ask for the next question. I'm going to ask for the answers also to try to be a little bit on the tight side, because there's quite a few people who seem to want to ask questions. Yes, ma'am.
Alan, you started out tonight by saying that the 9/11 was a failure of personnel and not the law. And I think both of you said tonight that torture exists in many of our questioning of alleged criminals. So the question I have is, why do you think a legal solution of creating torture warrants would do anything to improve our safety and security if torture existed and it didn't prevent 9/11? It seems more from what you're debating an after-the-fact solution, not a ticking bomb case.
Well, it grows out of my experience in looking at the Israeli situation, where after it became brought to the surface by the Landau Commission, and after the proposal for the torture warrant surfaced, the amount of torture, and B'Tselem and other organizations confirm this, went down dramatically. That is, there's a big difference if you tell a group of security agents, look, don't ask, don't tell, you got to do it, don't tell us the criteria, we're just leaving it up to you. That's when it becomes pervasive in a system. Interesting historical. I just got to take 1 minute. You'll be interested in this. John Langbaine wrote a whole book on torture warrants in medieval England and medieval France in the 15th and 16th centuries. In England, you needed a torture warrant. You had to go to the head chief judge to get a torture warrant. They actually know, they've documented every case of torture, 108 and 100 years. In France, every local gendarme could do it. When they both tried to abolish torture at about the same time, the English were able to do it instantaneously because they had developed a system of torture with accountability, whereas the French had developed a system of torture without accountability. It took them 200 years, and they didn't succeed completely until after the Algerian Revolution was over. So my point is based on empiricism. My goal is to eliminate torture, to reduce it, if necessary, to the least possible amount. We have no difference about goals. Our only difference is which is a better means in a democracy for dealing with this issue.
Next question.
Wouldn't it be hypocritical of us to preaching human rights through all these countries like North Korea, Iraq, and Iran that have awful human rights records and we torture?
It's more hypocritical when we torture and preach it and deny that we're doing it. We are signatories to the Geneva Convention, which provides that there are no possible exceptions to the anti-torture warrant. We are signatories to that. The French are signatories to that. The British are signatories to that. The Israelis are signatories to that. And I'm only talking about the democracies that torture notwithstanding that. What can be more hypocritical than signing a treaty knowing full well that we have a low-level institutionalized method for continuing it so that we can preach hypocritically?
Of course, it's the low-level torture that we really have to make a serious effort to eradicate. We haven't really made much of an effort. You know, once in a while we get the Louima cases, but in fact, that's because it's a high-profile case. Most of the cases go unpunished.
Of course.
And that's the problem.
Louima was done for there wasn't even a claimed reason. It was just done to torture, right?
I just wanted to say a couple of things. It's all very well for us to sit and talk about torture here. Most of us have never seen it, never been a part of it. When it comes right down to it, there are things worse than death. And I just
like what? Like what?
Like being tortured.
No, you see, I just fundamentally disagree. I think if that were true, then none of us would have surgery.
Let her finish the question.
Okay.
I'm speaking from personal experience about this. It took me 10 years to overcome something that was done to me in a very short time. The question that I have to ask is, how are you going to protect the people that are innocent, that are not hijacking planes, that you want to stick needles under their fingernails?
Well,
how are you going to protect?
How are you? I can throw it back at you. How are you going to protect the thousands of people who would otherwise die at the World Trade Center? I mean, you can't throw cliches around about how do you protect the innocent. I'm talking about a choice of horrible evils. I'm not talking about the Louima case. I'm talking about the case where if you don't administer 2 or 3 hours of excruciating pain to somebody, people will die. Death is worse than pain. That's my bottom line.
My question is not whether you administer the torture, it's whether you know that the person is guilty before you administer this torture.
I think it's a very good
question. That's why I want to judge.
Because it seems to me you debase a society when you allow a judge to issue a torture warrant, and then it turns out judges are wrong. By the way, judges do make mistakes, don't they, Judge Gass?
They do, with regularity, yes.
And,
I've never heard of that.
And, many cases where they issue a search warrant and there are no
policemen don't make mistakes.
And, of course policemen make mistakes.
So, the policemen make fewer mistakes or more mistakes when it has to get a judicial approval. By the way, the Constitution is what talked about judicial approval. The warrant requirement comes out of the Fourth Amendment.
Policemen shouldn't be in the business of torturing people. However, if we allow a judge to say, well, if certain is okay, can you imagine the station house? Hey, Henry, the judge said the torture isn't so bad. Let's give this guy a little lesson.
No, the judge says torture, that's exactly the opposite of my point. Torture is horrible. It should never be permitted, except if you can make the argument, in the most extraordinary cases, under no other circumstances should it be permitted. Today we have a message that's very different. Today we have a message, well, if you got to do it, just don't tell us about it. Ma'am, if you don't like it, there's a movie across the street that's playing, so you can go there.
Yes, next question.
On that note, going back to the national ID thing, I guess what I'm worried about is that it's a time when a lot of people are looking for the government for safety, for security, and I'm wondering if does this really do that? Is it just playing on our emotions that, it's like a perceived sense of safety? It's going to be another government program that's going to waste billions of taxpayer dollars, or how much it's going to cost, similar to the military buildup in the 80s against the Soviet threat that some people now think really wasn't there.
Let's let Mr. Silverglate take that one. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure. I think there was a Soviet military threat, although I actually think I have a different theory for why the Cold War was won. I think we bankrupted the Soviet Union with an arms buildup that nearly bankrupted us as well, but we have more dough, so we survived it. But I think there are these real threats. But I don't think that the solution, for example, of a national ID, really provides substantial security. If it did provide substantial security, I'd at least have to think harder about it. I still might come to the conclusion that it's not worth changing the look and feel of a free society. We still should not give the constable the power to demand you produce an identity and force you to carry an identity card. I think that's 1984 as far as I'm concerned, not worth it. But I don't really have to get too worried about what I'm saying, because I don't think the ID card is really going to provide much additional security. So it's an easy case for me.
It's an easy case if you take that empirical view. It becomes even more compelling moral and legal case if you take the view that torture could be effective, that ID cards could work. Then it really presents a very difficult dilemma, and I think that's the dilemma that we're really talking about here today.
On the issue of torture, you keep raising thousands of people, which I think is hyper rhetoric, which is getting people excited. What if it's one person? What if it's thousands of people? And what level of proof do you have to have? What are you requiring? Is it just suspicion? Is it absolute proof? Where does that line get set? And how is that indicated? They do a lot of things now on suspicion, and then afterwards it's proven that there's no justification.
What would be the standard for torture warrants?
Well, the big difference is I would have a standard. Today there is no standard.
What standard be?
Let me start by saying better a standard than no standard. So the first question you ask is, what is the standard the police are using today? What is the standard the FBI is using today? What is the standard the CIA is using today? My standard would be absolute certainty of guilt, and in each of these cases there is absolute certainty. The kidnapping case, the guy showed up for the ransom. In the other cases that I hypothesized, you have a tape recording of him planning the event. I would have absolute certainty, much higher standard than you have for a conviction in a case.
Absolute certainty of guilt that the person was a joint venturer in this crime?
Well, let me get, with the permission of the woman in the back who doesn't like what I'm saying, I noticed in time that when people say you talk too much, it's often that they don't agree with what you're saying. They never complain about hearing you if they agree with you, but notwithstanding, I'm not going to be cowed by that, so I'll continue my answer. The question is the standard of proof. Now, it seems to me the standard has to be extraordinarily high, but a standard is better than no standard. What I'm looking for is an end to standardlessness, beginning of accountability, the beginning of a debate on what the standard should be. And that, I think, is a major improvement over the standardlessness of the current situation.
I don't think the current situation is standardless at all, because under my proposal, the standard would be what, 12 out of 12 people decide they would probably do, and therefore in good conscience can convict somebody. I think that's the standard.
That's no
standard. It's a kind of standard of civilized, conduct. You've done something absolutely horrible, but was the circumstance one that even civilized people would agree they'd all probably do it themselves? I call that a standard, and it's, I think, far preferable to having a judge sort of figure out on the pain meter how much this particular case is worth.
It's interesting, you look at the history of the Fourth Amendment, it was precisely designed to avoid after-the-fact determinations by juries by requiring you to go to a judge and get advanced approval by somebody who was not involved in the quest for security, whose job it was to balance security versus liberty. That's what the Fourth Amendment opted for. Mine is a very traditional approach.
If a big mistake is made and the person is tortured erroneously, you're going to have it go to a jury anyways. But
you've had your question. I'd like to give the next person a chance.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask, how do any of what you proposed would have made any damn difference on September 11th?
Well, if remember when Moussaoui was arrested for trying to learn how to fly a plane straight but not up or down, and let's assume they had gotten into his computer, which they weren't able to get into because they couldn't get a warrant from a judge. If they had been able to get into his computer and his computer had said, we are planning to attack very large occupied buildings within the next 3 or 4 days, and they had given him immunity. Remember, once you have immunity, you are compelled to answer. It is illegal. It is a crime not to answer.
Well,
they can put you in jail the way they did Susan McDougal. Now the next question is, if we had this evidence and there was a certainty on his recording and on his web, whatever it is, that they had this information, that would be the case that Harvey would torture. Now the difference is, would Harvey torture in a visible way or just wait for a jury to acquit? Yes, it is possible that September 11th could have been prevented. 1,000 deaths is no longer hyperbolic after September 11th.
Maybe it's a little redundant, but in a perfect system, I think both of your alternatives on torture would provide the equivalent results. Cops would only do it in the cases that it was merited under the situation that you would have the judges allowing it. Unfortunately, we're not in the perfect system. The issue is whether you err by having a lot more problems brought in of torture, or whether you allow a few cases of acting under something that's considered illegal to come up in front of a jury of 12 men. I believe in the jury system, and I'd rather have the...
No case will ever come up in front of a jury. I promise you that. No prosecutor would ever prosecute a case where the torture produced the saving of lives. It just would not happen. It has never happened in our history, and it will never happen. It's an illusion to think that 12 jurors will ever get an opportunity to decide this. Some prosecutor, secretly and quietly in the bowels of his office, will make this decision. There will be no public record, by the way, about how many instances of torture there was. It was one point I haven't said. A torture warrant is a public document. It documents every single case and provides for public accountability. That's a big plus.
Yeah, my only point is that given the way juries deal with cops traditionally, they would probably be many more cases where they would kind of overlook situations where cop interpreted liberally, and rather than the other case where it is illegal and they would only allow people to go through for whom it was justified. That's my point.
I want to point out that in our state system, you don't have to get a prosecutor to bring a prosecution for torture. The victim can file an application for a criminal complaint. That's not true in the federal system, but it is true in the state system.
I'm a scholar. My book of expertise is Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. I brought you each a copy. May I?
I've read it.
May I bring it to you?
Yes.
No.
I say it's liberal. The pages are liberally marked. I say yes.
Torture is never acceptable under any circumstances.
We both agree. We both agree. Now the question is how to abolish it.
Let's have the question.
Number two.
Let's have the question.
National IDs are for the rule of law. People who work under the rule of law. The crook works under the rule of man. He will get around it no matter what. My questions are this. You didn't touch on separation of church and state quite at all. I read it in your book, Shouting Fire. I wasn't impressed with it. You only gave it a page and a half. I think that your argument was very poor. It was very weak. My questions are this.
204 to 224, by my count, that's 20 pages.
What your question is.
Okay.
Chapter, upholding the wall of separation. Chapter, when the wall comes tumbling down. Chapter, the right to disbelieve. So at least tell the truth.
Page 34 through 36
You never read beyond page 34 to 36,
okay.
So don't lecture the audience about the book.
Okay.
Good.
3 whole chapters on it.
Now, just recently there was a bill Lieberman has backed Bush on the faith-based initiative bill, and Bush has turned around and he's decided to back Israel. Now, can Lieberman be considered treasonous for giving away?
Come on, do we have to listen to this kind of insulting crap?
Come
on, don't denigrate the discussion. Yeah, I know you listen to me, but I'll listen to you.
He's giving away our civil rights by backing the faith-based initiative.
Okay, so here's the argument that this Jewish senator is committing treason in order to exchange separation of church and state for support for Israel. Right. Okay. Do we need to respond?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, and I don't think it's germane to the evening's subject. Thank you. Yes.
I wish the people who first enacted the income tax law could see what had become of it. I'm sure they would never have agreed to it. At the beginning, you raised a question, or you talked about the identification cards and said that the requirements would be far more stringent for visitors. How do you enforce that? Somebody comes along and refuses to show his card saying, I'm not a visitor, I don't have to show you a card. The result is that, of course, everybody will have to show the cards.
No, you'd have to have
you're not a visitor.
You'd have to have probable cause, clearly, for knowing that somebody was not appropriately in the country. You wouldn't be able to remember. I'm not suggesting in any way that you can just ask people for their ID. I am suggesting that every visitor would have to carry, every adult visitor would have to carry the card. The police would not be able to ask you for the card unless there was probable cause for believing you're out of status.
Yeah, you're saying every adult has to carry a card. Right. It's
adult visitor.
If you're a visitor, it's a different card. But your proposal is that citizens have to carry cards too.
No, they don't have to carry the card.
They have to have cards.
No, they have to have it if they're going to use it. What they would have to do is if they're going to use it at an if they're going to use it at an airport. Let me be very clear. I don't think anybody has to get that card if they don't want to fly or drive or go to a government building. It's only if you have to show your ID, then you darn well better have foolproof ID.
And
That's the only point.
It's up to the Congress to decide when you have to show an ID.
No, it's up to the Constitution, just as it is today.
If you're in circumstances where a visitor would have to show a card, then you better have a card, because otherwise how do you prove you're not a visitor?
No, I don't understand.
A resident is going to have to show a card.
Let me be very clear.
Where a visitor would have to show
Only people would have to show cards if they went to buildings in which they currently have to show cards in airports, etc.
If you want to do something or go somewhere.
Where's the difference between the visitors and the non-visitors?
There's no
to watch television.
Harvey is mocking it, but that's exactly the point he was making before. He was saying it's okay to do it at the airport because you don't have to fly. And then I said you don't have to take a train, you don't have to drive. So you're making my point. I'm not making you're making my point. The point is that today ID cards are pervasively required. Only difference I have is when you have to show it, it better be accurate. Virginia has proved to us that we have inaccurate cards, that Al-Qaeda has issued a directive how to circumvent. I just want to trump that issue.
Sir.
Yeah, I'm both saddened and horrified to hear a good civil libertarian say that essentially that we're going to get used to this idea of the national ID card, because I think you're damn right. But my question is on the torture issue. You laid out a 3-position possibilities on it. I think with your proposal, there's a 4th possibility that there will be a 2-tier system where some torture will be done under the guidance of judges and some will be done outside the system. Do you think that's a possibility also?
It's of course possible. The experience of two countries, 2 democratic countries, are to the contrary. In England, John Langbain did an extensive study and came to the conclusion that torture warrants, when they were introduced, limited the torture to cases where the warrants were applied for. And in Israel, there's no question that the amount of this abusive interrogation has been reduced. I have the experience of 2 countries to back me up. I would ask Harvey.
Reported abusive interrogations.
Well, you know, we're talking about reports by people who, when they're interrogated, are the first ones to complain because they're primarily Palestinians. There are 3 major civil rights organizations in Israel: B'Tselem, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and an Arab civil liberties organization. And I think there's agreement among all of them that they still complain that there's too much, but that the amount has gone down considerably. Also, in a democracy, visibility has its own claim, and accountability has its own claim of being a virtue.
This is going to be the last. No. The next question. This is the last question. I'm sorry to say. You, sir.
Oh, great. Professor Dershowitz, have you considered that the necessity defense is a way of, in practice, keeping the requirements for the inevitable torture to be high? What bothers me when I hear your discussions is that you always postulate as a hypothetical, a high standard, the ticking time bomb case, the case where a child is dying. But I fear that if you start institutionalizing this system, the judges are going to be basically putting torture warrants on rubber stamps. Anybody who comes in with a good sob story, we've got a child in danger, we think there might be an attempt on somebody's life, is going to get a torture warrant because the judge will just think, what if I'm wrong? Do I want to be the guy who got the president killed because I did not authorize this torture warrant? So
it's a very fair question. I apologize for answering, but it was directed at me, so I think I'm going to answer the question. I have written in this book extensively against the use of necessity defense. I think it is the most undemocratic. It is the most lawless of all defenses. The necessity defense, if it were ever institutionalized in this country, would have been used by Oliver North to defend the foreign policy excesses, would have been used by President Nixon. It's inconsistent with a democracy to have a necessity defense which says that if you really think you got to do it, you do it, and we're going to leave it to 12 bigoted jurors in the South to decide whether it was necessary to lynch blacks, or whether it was necessary to do this or necessary to do that. All of what you suggested may be true. Judges may, in fact, issue too many torture warrants. My only point is the empirical evidence shows that when you require a judge, in addition to the policeman on his own doing it, that is a protection. If you don't believe me, ask James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, those who wrote the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution and who came to the conclusion that policemen alone searching and seizing and using deadly force is not as protective as policemen plus the requirement of a judicial warrant. That's why I take the position I take.
Anybody who has seen some of the search warrants issued by some of our well-educated judges will understand that it is very easy for a police officer to get a search warrant.
Anybody who's seen...
And the system will inevitably deteriorate into one where they will be rubber stamped. I think the questioner is correct.
I think I'm going to declare the evening closed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can we...
this was, to say the least, a spirited debate.
Thank you.
And thank you for your participation.